Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Luisa Moro, for having me here. I was very, very happy to receive your invitation. And the reason I'm happy to receive the invitation is because I'm just starting at a new university. I will be setting up a local or a regional surveillance system, and therefore I really start from scratch again where I work. And therefore I also thought, because Freiburg in Germany, in Germania, is just on the other side of the mountains, it's actually probably quite nice to collaborate at a regional level and come more often and exchange experience. And that is why I thought this is a very important meeting, and I'm happy to share what my thoughts or our thoughts are about regional surveillance. Okay, this is Freiburg for everybody who wants to escape the heat. It's not much colder than here. It's also a very warm part in Germany, although the forest sometimes gives shade. And it's a nice place to be. And I'm happy after 20 years to be back in Freiburg, because I was trained in Freiburg, first as a nurse and then as a medical doctor, and then specialized under the guidance of Professor Daschner in Freiburg before I left, and traveled for 20 years in Europe. And now I'm happy to be back to close a big circle. So I will want to just take you through my talk, and I have no conflict of interest, and that's unfortunate, because I hope next time I have some conflicts of interest. That means also some more money. And I will first start probably by introducing to you what I will not talk about. And I will want to shape actually your attention. First of all, if you want to set up surveillance systems, you must be very clear in your mind why you do it, what you will use the data for. Why do you want surveillance? And there are many different stakeholders out there that want your data, but you have to be very clear for what you want the data to be used for. For example, I give you an example. The European Commission at the time when we set up EARS was interested in the heat map that Gianni Rossolini explained to you. They wanted to know where is the problem in Europe in order to instigate national interest. So if it's red, please do something. If it's green, well, you don't have a problem. That's a political instrument, and it is what we call population-based surveillance. And I will not be talking about population-based surveillance. I will show you population-based surveillance is a good way to measure, if you can do it, but that's also a can of worms. If you can measure incidence, you will have an estimate of individual risk. It's very difficult to measure incidence. EARS never measured incidence. We always measure just the proportional resistance among a single pathogen. It's very difficult. And when you measure incidence, if you can do that, then you can actually also estimate the burden of disease, and therefore also say, okay, antibiotic resistance, the problem is this big, and it is only 1/3 of oncological problems, or it's half of the cardiological problems in terms of mortality and morbidity. That is what politicians want in order to guide decisions. If you want to help politicians to guide decisions, you need this type of surveillance. I will not be talking about population-based surveillance, however. And there is another way of looking at surveillance that is from the patient point of view. Patient-based surveillance is when you want to use your data in your hospital or in your region to improve the therapy, the empirical therapy of your patient. If you know that urinary tract infection is 60% caused by E. coli, and E. coli is 60% resistant to ciprofloxacin, you may not prescribe ciprofloxacin. So you can use data on resistance in your region to decide empirical treatment. That's certainly also a very important aspect of surveillance, but I will not be talking about this today. What I will be talking about is actually pathogen-based surveillance. So we come from the population at large, we go to the patient, and now we even go to the minimum that you can see through the microscope, to the bacteria themselves. And we look at the bacteria and their biology and try to use that knowledge of the biology of bacteria in order to understand how bacteria spread through the system. That's pathogen-based surveillance. And with this information, sorry, one moment. If I talk too long, can you stop? I do. And with this information, this can be translated into prevention and control. And I will show you how we want to do this. It's a challenge, but it can be achieved. And I'm now challenged to set this up in my region de novo. So the overview of my talk, I first will talk about the biology of the bacteria, and I will basically talk about the genetics of bacteria, because with the understanding of the genetics of bacteria, we can draw phylogenies, we can defer where these bacteria come from. And if we know their ancestral origin, we can also plot this on maps, and we can see how bacteria move across Europe, for example. Then I will talk about transmission, and at the end I will talk about transmission networks. Now let me give you an example which is rather recent, and it is not yet published. Well, this is published because it's the only paper so far where a group in Cambridge, led by Nick Thompson and Kath Holt, have collected 328 Klebsiella pneumonia globally, and they have sequenced these Klebsiella genomes, and they put them on a tree, and this is the tree from the publication. I will later briefly explain you what you really see here, but I want to show you another tree, and that's our own tree. And I'm very happy to collaborate in this field also with Gianni Rossolini from the University of Florence, where we do all the susceptibility testing. Now, this is the tree also of Klebsiella pneumonia from a collection of European isolates, but it is a much larger collection. This collection includes 1,717 isolates, and they have all been collected at the same moment in time. And this was a 6-month period between 2013 and April 2014. So November 2013 to April 2014, 6 months. All these isolates have been sequenced, the whole genome has been sequenced, and based on the similarity of the genomes, we are able to draw these trees. Now, what do these trees tell us? This is the next thing I would briefly to explain to you. Now, first of all, it doesn't look like a tree. It looks a bit like a comet, doesn't it? It has this long tail and a star-like appearance in the front. Now, I was looking quite a long time to see actually a tree that could be similar, and I came to the willow tree. Now, the willow tree has something in common with our tree in that on top, sort of all these branches explode and have equal length. This is pretty much like the tree I showed you. Why is that? Because the willow tree is cut every winter, and then all the branches start growing at the same time. And probably this is what also happened with our tree. But I want to just show to you that branches that are younger are obviously branches of the branches that come at a much later stage. So these are the young branches, these are the old branches. Now back to our tree, which is this one. You can see this is the long stem, and we call this the root, because it's rooted on an outgroup, which is Klebsiella type B or Klebsiella varicola, which is up here in our case. Now this tree is, and we are looking only now, we want to concentrate on the top where this branching extends and where all of these branches seem to be equally old. I can tell you when we look at this in more detail, and now I have to try to see if I can do this live, which is always dangerous to do, from the internet. Just let me just see how I get there, probably here. Aha, here we go. Yes. So this is now an illustration live from the internet, from a website that you can also download very soon when we have written our manuscript, but it will be a genuine tool where you could download always all your sequences as well, as long as you have sequences and you have a tree and you have the locations from where the isolates come from. So here is the map of Europe. These are all the dots where we collected the isolates. This is the tree, and the tree talks to the map, and this is all linked electronically. So if I click here and redraw the subtree, I can concentrate only on the top of the tree. So I cut off the root, and these are now 1,649 isolates. And you see that most of the isolates are on equal long branches. So they come from a mega event, which is probably some 25,000 years ago, when all these Klebsiella started spreading. We don't know what was happening at that time, and it also doesn't matter for surveillance. It's maybe something for microbiology. Interesting, however, are young branches, things that branched off very recently. And there you see, for example, here or here or here, a lot of these branches that have a lot of buds where new branches exist. And new branches are always indicative of a branch that has become very successful. Now, why is this so important? We can look at this for a moment in more detail. If I click here on this branch and then this branch is highlighted, you see already that all the isolates that are sitting up here, I'm just going to redraw just that, are from this part of the European map, and the red ones are KPC3 producers. Now, where are the KPC3 producers here on the tree? I can show you that when I make these nodes a bit larger, and you see the red ones are up here, and you wonder where are they coming from, and you can root the tree on an outgroup. You look at that, and then you ask yourself, what is this little thing coming from? You can go there. Actually, you can click here. And I can tell you already now, because it's just not shown too well, that they are mostly from Greece and from tourists that have been in Greece. And this is Klebsiella pneumonia, and if you look at this sequence type, which is sequence type 258, right? So these are all 258s, and when you look at the rest of the tree up here, which is probably the part from here onwards. Okay, let's go here. This part of the tree comes mainly from Italy, and it is sequence type 521. Mainly 521. Okay? So you can still look deeper into the tree, and you can find some isolates that are actually embedded. Some are actually not even resistant, but most of them are resistant. So what I'm actually telling you here, and now I'm going back to the slides, is that we are having a means by sequencing and analyzing the data, a means to understand where bacteria are coming from and how they spread. More importantly, this I had already made in case this didn't work. More importantly, we can now explain what happens on the ears map, where the countries which are red for Klebsiella, which is Italy, Greece, and Israel, not on the ears map, where they are on the tree. And when you look at it, they are only on a single branch. This is one message I wanted to start to sort of rub in to make you really understand. Transmission is a property of all bacteria, but a privilege of very few. There is one clone that spreads through southern Europe like wildfire. And we know that it has arrived in Spain, and in Spain is exactly the same pattern repeating. So what is happening here? So we are talking about bacteria, but I will not forget completely the hosts of the bacteria, because I believe that transmissibility is not only a property of bacteria, but it could also be a property of hosts that carry these bacteria and carry them around. For that reason, we have very early, I think it's almost 10 years ago, I had a very good doctorate at the National Institute of Public Health in the Netherlands, where we did most of this work. We have looked at the Dutch patient referral network. We looked at patients that went to the Netherlands in Holland to hospital. And we looked especially to patients that have been in hospital twice or more, to look where do they go, how do they move from one hospital to another. And that allowed us to draw a map of the Netherlands, and within the map we could actually identify the hospitals, locate them and connect them and make the connections thick if many patients move between, for example, Zwolle and Groningen, or Utrecht and Amsterdam, or thin if there are very few patients that move from Zwolle here to Duinhoven or so. Now, this is the Dutch network, and what you can see, let me just, okay, I just realized that my pointer doesn't show. Do I have a laser in case? Okay, if not, in the center of these points, you always see red squares. Do you see the red squares? The red squares are the university hospitals, right? And the blue triangles are large teaching hospitals, and the little ones are just the normal hospitals. These are all hospitals of the Netherlands, and these are all patient movements of 2004. Now, the Netherlands is a small country. We wanted to have a much richer database in order to really draw inference on from patient movements to transmissions. Yes, thank you. Okay, so red dots in the middle, So we looked actually at another country where more people live, hence there are more hospitals, and probably from the shape of it you can already identify this is England, where London, let me just see, lies down there. I can hardly see this there, okay? And the rest of the country. So this is the map of 146 hospitals in England, and the connectors are the patients that move between them in a year's period, in a year's time. And we took the financial year 2006 as the financial year 2007 for all the patient movements. So we are dealing here with 51 million inhabitants. We have the statistics from the NHS for financial year 2007, and we have 146 acute care hospitals, of which 25 are university, 42 are large hospitals, 50 are medium-sized, and 29 are small acute hospitals. In that year, 7.4 million patients went to hospital to stay in a hospital, to be admitted in a hospital. And that was on about 13 million occasions. So you can see a couple of patients went more than once to hospital, and these are the ones that create the network. So now I want to show you what these networks look like and what are the mathematical hallmarks of these networks, because these are very important for your control efforts and very important for designing your surveillance systems. If you use a different way of displaying the hospitals in England, not the geographic way that I showed you before, which is explicit where the points are where they are on the map, but you use a different trick, which is what we call a rubber band plot, where rubber bands exert sort of traction force on hospitals that are more often collaborating with each other because they share more patients, you get this type of picture. Now, this type of picture obviously doesn't look like England at all anymore, but still, when you look at it, there is still a geographical signal in it, because up here in the north, let me just see, up here in the north, this is the Liverpool area. This is the Manchester area, close to Liverpool, you know, remember the football matches go in between them. This is Birmingham, this is Midlands, East Midlands, this is east of England, down here is London. And there is clearly collaboration between hospitals that are in close proximity geographically. A second thing that you see here is what we call centrality. In the center of all these modular networks, of all these regional networks, you see hospitals that are indicated by a square. Now, squares stand for university hospitals. Diamonds stand for large hospitals. Large round dots stand for medium-sized hospitals, and the small dots are the small hospitals. And wherever you look, you will find that the squares are in the middle, and the diamonds are around the squares, and so there is a hierarchy of hospitals that are connected by patient movements. Well, that's quite normal, because patients usually go to the next door hospital, and when the next door hospital sees that the patient has something that requires more proficiency, a higher capacity, they will be referred to university hospitals. And therefore the university hospital naturally comes into the center of the network. So we have two things already which are properties of networks. There is regional collaboration, so that is regionality, and there is centrality. Now the centrality has some other important issue. I remember very well when we had the MRSA epidemic. I was working in England, in Nottingham, and there was a lot of pressure built up by the political agenda to clean the hospitals, because they said hospitals that have a lot of MRSA are dirty, and hospitals that have little MRSA are the clean ones. And therefore there was a big campaign to clean hospitals in England. Now we had an alternative explanation, although much later. We looked at the amount of patients, and that is depicted here in A, the amount of patients that enter a hospital that have previously been already treated in another hospital. And the gray bars here, the gray dots, sorry I have to do this here, I'm always confused. The gray dots here, where there's a T down here, the gray dots are the teaching hospitals. The blue ones are the large, the red ones are the middle, the S and the small ones. Then in this panel, you see a crowd of graphs all together. These are all the 146 hospitals that have by law to report their MRSA rates in bacteremia, right? And this is how they get penalized, because they say the ones with the high rates are the dirty ones, but just look at that. The high ones are the teaching hospitals. And the second ones are the large hospitals and so on. And that correlation is significant for all financial years, except for the last one, where MRSA really appeared to disappear in England. What we think, what really happens is that patients that have been treated with antibiotics for diagnostic purpose in other hospitals enter university hospitals, probably already colonized, and introduce infectious or antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the large hospitals. So centrality matters. One more thing, and that's again something that I already almost showed you with our tree that I showed you before. If you look at the connectivity, you will see that the majority, and that's here on the y-axis is the frequency, so the very high frequency, that's the majority, have very little connection weight. So they are not much connected. They send from Papworth to Hinchinbrooks, they send 5 patients per year. That's all. They're not very connected. But that's the majority of them. Whereas a few at the other end of the scale, and remember this is logarithmic scale and this is logarithmic scale, and the regression line is a straight line, which is a very peculiar marker in mathematics. Very few hospitals have very few hospitals have very large connectivity, and these are the university hospitals. University hospitals connect with each other. So what we have here is a scale-free dynamics. It's mathematics, but it's very easy and everybody understands it. That is a principle of all self-governing and self-emerging natural network systems. The wealth of nations is divided in the 20% of the population that earn 80% of the national income, whereas 20% of the rest of the whereas the 80% rest of the population only earn 20% of the income. That's the same principle. So in hospital epidemiology, we are always dealing with very highly non-linear dynamics. There's always a core dynamic. There's always few that do all. There are always few that are very transmissible. There are always few that are the core group. There are always few that drive an epidemic. HIV epidemic in the early 80s was driven by a small core group of homosexual men that were very promiscuous, that had an enormous amount of partners and were very well connected worldwide because many of them were flying staff from American Airlines. I'm just making this up, but you know the story. The process is always the same. It's few that drive the epidemics, and our core group that we are dealing with are not the young ones that are highly promiscuous. They are at the other end of the age scale. They are much older. They have a patient career, and during their patient career, because they are ill, have picked up resistant phenotypes or resistance genes, and then slowly enrich their repertoire of resistance genes by moving from one hospital to the other. And that's a core group dynamic as well. So this is what you call scale freeness. This is the 2080 law that I just told you, scale freeness. Now, then there is another feature of networks, which I also want to explain to you because it's really exciting, I find. And it has also a lot to do with social networks, even with when you look at Twitter and the like and all the stories about fake news. But here we look at antibiotic resistance. It's always the same symmetry. There was a person by the name of Stanley Milgram in 1962 who had this fantastic idea or hypothesized that every person on the planet, by mapping all their friends, would be connected to the President of the United States of America by only 6 degrees of separation. So 6 friends would suffice to end up in the White House. Probably nowadays not anymore, but that's different. But it would be it shows you that we are dealing what we call small world networks. We are dealing with what we call small world networks. When you meet someone of your friends in Hong Kong, or you meet someone who has a friend that you also have, you say, oh, it's a small world, isn't it? And that's exactly it. How do we explain small world networks? Now, if you look at your neighborhood, you know the people in the street, you know your families, and you know your friends at work. That's an organized network. It's very organized and it's very regional. It's just the ones that surround you. That does not make a small world network. If the whole world would consist out of neighborhood networks, it would take ages, forever it would take, to get to the President of the United States. The only thing that is just missing is that within your network, there's probably 1 or 2 that has a brother that works in South Africa. So these are random far connectors. And random far connectors, they need to be random and they need to be few. Connect all the networks and make them a small world network. In England, when you look at the regional networks, they're also quite nicely organized. You see Manchester down here at about 7 o'clock, and the connectors, they have very few patients go to Birmingham, and from Newcastle, very few patients go to Leeds. They are also in vicinity, and these are these random connectors that bring the English healthcare network together to make it a small world network, which means, and we calculated that on average, you only need 4.3 referrals to move from any hospital in England to any other hospital in England on average. Now in the Netherlands, this takes 5 referrals, and although it doesn't seem a lot of difference, it does make a lot of difference. So we have now 4 features of our networks, which is regionality, centrality, scale freeness, and small world. And finally, we come to something which is called tipping point dynamics. All these networks are having a resilience. They can bear so much before it ends up in chaos. And these tipping points are typically unpredictable. They don't know when they occur, but when they occur, there is all by a sudden randomness in the system and the whole network architecture collapses. So when do you see these things getting really difficult? We compared England with the Netherlands. Both have not reached a tipping point. But what you can already see in the Netherlands, which is blue, it takes much longer on average to reach 100 hospitals. There are only about 90 hospitals, to reach all hospitals in our model calculations based on patient referrals, whereas England in red is much quicker to reach the 146 hospitals. Time to 50 hospitals infected in England, double the speed than in the Netherlands. And more importantly here, these are the 2 bars. The Dutch bar, the dark blue bar, is the amount of stochastic extinction. That are epidemics that just run out, they die out on the way. They're not reaching every other hospital. Whereas in England, because the hospitals are much better connected, very few epidemics. You start an epidemic in Kettering, and you will end up having also an epidemic in Liverpool. Very few die out. Actually, the Netherlands is 14 times more likely that epidemics die out than in the Netherlands, than in England. Mind you, it's not the search and destroy policy of the Netherlands. It's just the conservative referral system. The Dutch don't send patients to Rotterdam if they live in the north. They treat them locally and they stay locally. And that protects and increases the resilience of national healthcare systems. So keep the patients where they are would be probably the message. We also looked at the catchment populations, because in England we had the postal codes of the patients, and here in the heat map you see in dark blue patients that stay in their local networks, and the yellow and the red ones are those that decide to go between networks. You can see it's actually quite nicely divided into very discrete regional healthcare networks. Only on the border the people decide, do I go west or do I go right? Interestingly, the healthcare network borders that we decided to determine from the decision of patients do not necessarily coincide with the administrative border. So you cannot expect Emilia-Romagna, everybody living in Emilia-Romagna will eventually end up in Modena or in Bologna in the hospital. They may also go to Lombardia and end up in Milano. So you have to find out your own network in order to say, these are the hospitals I would like to collaborate with. Just one more slide in order to just give you, I'm getting to the end, and then we may want to discuss a little bit. So I believe this is just a random photo out of a flight when there was no cloud. And what you see here is what you call fractal river systems. So it's just a river. I don't even know where it was, Africa or where. But this is pretty much what I wanted to show you. Normally, you would get patients from your own catchment population. They would be coming somewhere from an area defined by this mountain. And if they live on this side of the edge, they would go to their doctor. Their doctor would send them probably to a local hospital. If the local hospital decides, well, maybe the better to have a second opinion, goes to a large hospital. Eventually, if it's actually something that needs operation, ends up in a university hospital. This is the natural thing. So you would expect only to get your antibiotic resistance that emerges in your catchment population, was it not for the far distant connectors, which are few. Right? So my appeal now is, and I'm not going to talk about MRSA now, I wanted just to discuss that with you. So having said what I said, my approach now in Germany would be to identify based on, because we don't have the data, this is the problem, we don't have the data. The ones that have the data are the insurance companies, but I have made friends with one of the insurance companies, which is fortunately the largest insurance companies in Germany, and they promised me that they will support me. So what we want, based on this, which is probably a sample and not representative maybe for everybody, based on that sample, we want to draw a map, pretty much what we did in the Netherlands and in England. And what we really want is in our region to identify those hospitals that really collaborate with our university hospitals. That's number one. Find them, make it visible on the map, produce a slide that really illustrates how closely we are connected, and then bring the CEOs, the directors of these hospitals all around the table. I haven't done that yet because I'm scared, because it's a challenge. But I believe it's possible, because what we then do is, listen, we will say, we all share the same destiny. We all have the same problems, so let's work together. Let's be transparent of what problems we have, develop a communication network between us, and let us share also the isolates. Let's have one of us have the sequencer and be the reference laboratory, and that one be equipped to promise that every isolate is sequenced within a week. In that way, you would have a couple of things in place which would be regional, because that's the way where you expect the problems to come from. You would have a radar screen in the region which could tell you which isolates are spreading, and you could even develop a diagnostic method to identify the isolates that are spreading, but that's maybe in the next step. So the first step is bring people together, and importantly, while bringing people together, you have to be aware that you have to appeal to the common fate and destiny. There is no point of wrangling, I want to have it doesn't matter who gets the sequencer and who becomes the reference laboratory, just be open. One should have it for the sake of the people that you treat. We could show that this works for MRSA perfectly well. We even did it on molecular level. We could even show that we can identify isolates that come from a different regional network and is introduced from Leeds to Portsmouth, because there are signature sequences in MRSA that predict where the isolate is coming from across the nation. But one thing that I want to bring up, and that's the last thing, which is close to my heart, and it's very controversial in present times, because we all talk about One Health. And I was wondering if life-saving investment into antimicrobial resistance surveillance or combating antimicrobial resistance should actually go via the One Health approach. Is it really One Health or not? How are we going to reconcile the epidemic spread of AMR, which is associated with high-risk clones, as I could show you, for MRSA, for Acinetobacter, for Klebsiella, for E. coli, for anything that is resistant? There are few high-risk clones. How can we reconcile the knowledge of high-risk clones with a One Health approach? I don't see a chicken there. I don't see a cow. I see some pigs for MRSA in the Netherlands, but was it a problem for hospitals? No, it was not a problem for hospitals. And I show you a publication that comes from this country. It's the incidence of colonization and bloodstream infections with carbapenemase-resistant Enterobacteriaceae in children receiving antineoplastic chemotherapy in Italy. And here it says, during a 2-year observation period, we observed a 3-fold increase in colonization rate and a 4-fold increase in bloodstream infection episodes caused by CPE, with a 90-day mortality of 14%. Now, just think about this. Are we really well advised to spend scarce research resources for a One Health approach if we want to save patient lives in European hospitals? And that is my mantra. Given the limited supply of research funding, I regard it as irresponsible to portray a One Health approach as beneficial for patients that are at risk of infections with AMR pathogens in our intensive care units, for example. Ladies and gentlemen, I come to the conclusion transmission of healthcare-associated multi-drug resistant organisms is characterized by highly non-normal dynamics, non-linear, non-normal, whereby very few cases, where very few cause many and many cause few. Infection control measures should regard national healthcare networks and not only individual hospitals as the target of interventions. And this has become legislation in the Netherlands. Our work has convinced the Minister of Health in the Netherlands, that's Margot Schippers, that the combat of AMR is not down to the hospitals, it's not down to the country, it's down to the regional healthcare networks defined by the patient movements and not defined by administrative borders. And there's a 5-year program that has become legislation last year. And real-time patient tracking combined with rapid genomic analysis is essential for the early management of the emergence and introduction of high-risk Crohn's into regional referral networks. And that can be achieved by identifying regional reference laboratories that have very rapid response times. Thank you for listening to me. These are the people that helped me doing all that work. That is Chibo Donker, who is my doctorate. He's now working at the University of Oxford for Derek Crook. Mariano Ciccolini, he decided to follow the money. He works now for the gas company in Northern Holland. Sharon Peacock at the Cambridge Edinburgh Hospital. Sandra Reuter now works with me. She is well versed in bioinformatics and sequencing. Then the work all done in the Sanger Center, which is David Annenson, Sophia David, Julian Parkhill. I forgot to mention actually Gianni Orsolini and Tommaso Gianni, who in Florence actually do all the phenotypic analysis and the antibiotic resistance testing of these 2,500 isolates that we have from the USCAPE collection. And then Imperial College London, David Annenson, who developed the website that I showed to you, then the Bureau of Statistics and the hospital episode statistics of the National Health Service in the UK, and you for listening to me. Thank you very much.